Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another installment of the EBI seminar series on science communications. I'm joined today by Dione Rossiter, also known as Dee. Dee is currently the Executive Director for Science at Cal, but is also a proud scientist and educator within the field of science communications. Hi there, Dee. How are you today?
I am great. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for being here. Okay, so we have a series of questions, and I'm going to jump in with the first one, which is, can you give us a description of your current roles and how your path has led you to where you are now?
Sure. Yeah. I actually was an undergrad at UC Berkeley. I started in physics, actually. And the reason I'm bringing this up, because it has to do with this science communication and the systemic racism topic of science communication, is that this was kind of a time in my life where I started counting the people of color in the room, the women in the room. And more often than not, I was the only one of either group. And we didn't really have the words for welcoming or belonging or inclusion. At least I didn't have those words. And so physics was really hard for me because I never quite felt comfortable in that space. So I ended up switching majors to earth and planetary sciences because I started working in the field of climate change and atmospheric science. And so I got the earth and planetary sciences department has an atmospheric science track. So I started in atmospheric science. I also got the science education bug and started working at the Lawrence Hall of Science. After I finished my undergraduate, I continued to work at the Lawrence Hall of Science until I went to grad school. I also remained in earth and planetary sciences in grad school, again, in atmospheric science, climate change, kind of space. And I went to grad school knowing actually that I wasn't going to be a bench scientist, which is a pretty unique perspective, especially for, 15 years ago. One didn't usually say, I know that I'm not going to be a scientist, but I'm going to get a PhD in science anyways. And I did that because I loved science and I knew that I could use my degree in science to work in this space between science and the public, and which is exactly what I did. I'm going to fast forward and say when I finished my PhD, I started working in Washington, D.C. And I got a job in Washington, D.C. at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, also known as AAAS, the publisher of science. And in fact, when I was a graduate student, I had been awarded a fellowship, a AAAS Mass Media Science and Engineering Fellowship. And I ended up spending a summer being a reporter in Washington, D.C., a science reporter. And after I finished my degree, I was really excited to get back to DC, and B, work in this space of science communication, outreach, engagement, policy, sort of at the forefront of DEI work and those sorts of things. So I worked at AAAS as the director of the Mass Media Fellowship Program, also as the manager of the Minority Science Writers Interns Program, which is at Science, and also as a project director within their education directorate, which I was in charge of a lot of public engagement events and activities. So I did all of that at AAAS. I ended up then transferring to Carnegie Institution for Science, where I was the manager of their science engagement and outreach for the entire institution. I worked within the president's office to do that. And then it was time to come back to California, where I'm from and where I love. And I came back to California. And now, as you said, I'm the executive director of Science at Cal. And Science at Cal is a program that shares UC Berkeley STEM research with the community. And we do that through free programming, open programming. I work directly with the scientists on how to engage with the public. We work on their broader impact work, which basically means that their requirement to share STEM with society. And you can do that in a number of different ways. And one of those ways is through education, outreach, DEI work, science communication. So all that work has brought me to a space where now I can work with a Cal scientists on how do we be essentially kind of better scientists by working at the intersection of science and society. In addition, this topic that is about systemic racism in science communication is really, really near and dear to my heart because of the experiences that I had through the fellowship program and then directing the fellowship program and then interacting and engaging with scientists and how they communicate their research to underrepresented groups, marginalized communities, and just to people who don't fall into this kind of general category of ivory tower individuals, essentially. Yeah.
Perfect. So if we could hone in a little bit more on your role as the director of the AAAS Fellowship Program, what concerns did you have and how do you hope to address these concerns nowadays?
Yeah, so it was interesting when I had the fellowship, I actually really loved my experience, but at the very end of the fellowship, the director at the time said, tell us about your experience. Do you have any things that you love or that you didn't love or that you'd like to change? And one of the things that I said was that while I did really, really appreciate the fellowship, I felt as though the fellowship was only reaching one segment of society. And that segment was, like I said, really the people who are digesting and reading and are science enthusiastic individuals to begin with, who are picking up the LA Times or, listening to NPR or reading the Oregonian or Chicago Tribune. And so I started doing a little bit more research about what kind of folks are even thinking or engaging or digesting, who's accessing STEM news in these traditional news outlets. And I learned that only 15% of US adults are literate. They can read at a university undergraduate level. Only 14%, 14% of all adults are illiterate. So these were actually really big numbers. Only 50% of adults read at an 8th grade level, either 8th grade or lower. So again, we're only really reaching a very small segment of the population through kind of traditional news outlets, writing print media. Another thing is that media is also changing all the time. So back, 15 years ago, talking about print media was something that we had to talk about because that's what the news agencies were writing. And now it's totally different, right? We have all this multimedia content that's coming out on the internet. Now almost everyone ends up getting their news from the internet. Over half of the population is still getting their news from watching TV, but that's slowly diminishing, right? Less and less people are getting their news from television and more are getting their news from online sources. And again, those sources don't have to be print. The other thing is there's these Pew Research articles and studies that are showing that depending on your race, your gender, your age, your income level, and your political affiliation, those all change the way that you digest news, that you get your news, actually. And so what that means is that if we want to target a specific demographic, then we can't just create one type of news or one type of science communication. So that was really revealing to me as well. Lastly, we learned is that there's not just is there a difference in the way that people are getting their news, but there's a difference by race, but there's also a different way that different literacy rates by race itself. So we can say, okay, 15% of US adults read at a university level, they can even read a newspaper. Well, in fact, if you look at different races, it's going to be much lower for Black and Hispanic populations, especially if you're thinking about their income level and other types of demographics as well. Another thing that I found that was pretty alarming was that diversity in newsrooms is also pretty grim. The statistics are, at least the latest statistics that we have, are that only 12 to 13% of newsroom staffs are diverse. And that's even lower when you're thinking about supervisors. So that means that news is getting filtered through a white lens. In addition, most newsrooms are filled with men. And so you're really, really getting news that's being filtered through a white male lens. And so that's also concerning. The other thing that I wanted to mention was I have these statistics, but I was also visiting the newsrooms. So I got to go to all of the newsrooms where I had mass media fellows. So that's over 25 different newsrooms in the United States. And I saw with my own eyes, I have this kind of quantitative data, but I also have anecdotal data that I was visiting newsrooms that was almost 100% completely white. And these were science, by the way, science newsrooms. So these were places like National Geographic and Discover Magazine and Wired. So I got to see kind of the demographics of the newsrooms. And all those things were really alarming to me, the statistics, and again, like what I was seeing and experiencing.
All right, perfect. So there were so many consequences that you mentioned, all these things that we should be alarmed by, but honing in on those, what are the consequences of these bad things? That being the lack of diversity in newsrooms, news not being culturally focused, the lack of targeted reporting in a way that's accessible to everyone. Why should we be concerned? What does this lead to?
Well, what really is the issue is that science literacy rates are very, very, very different across demographics. And when you look, so this is another study that I referenced, that's a Pew Research article study once again. And they show that actually college educated Black Americans are less science literate than non-college educated white Americans. And this is where the issue of we have a systemic problem, because there's no reason why that should be the case, except for the fact that we are living in society, and society is built upon white men, right? Built from this type of academic society, STEM society is. And so what that means is that we have people who are determining, how these systems are built, what buildings look like, what structures within the buildings look like, what the organizational structures look like, what are the norms of these structures, who's accepted in these spaces, who's not accepted in these spaces. And all of that leads us to kind of this inequality in how we are perceiving or intaking and then also regurgitating STEM. So we have this disparity in how people understand STEM, and that leads to a lot of repercussions that, and like, just think about if you can't get the information that you need because either you can't read what's being written or because you don't have access to what's being written, or because, like you said, what is being written isn't made for you, right? It's made for a specific demographic. Then that means that we have inaccuracies in information, we have misinformation, we have limited or access to services that people can actually even take advantage of. We have unhealthy norms and behaviors. We have an inability to act on opportunities even when they're available. And we have higher disease incidence, prevalence, and mortality. And the list goes on. And a really good example of this is COVID. We know that our most vulnerable communities were the communities that were struck the hardest. And so it was playing out in front of us. If we can't share information about how to protect ourselves from COVID from our most vulnerable communities, then those vulnerable communities are going to be the ones that suffer. And so this is like the consequences and you can think about this, COVID, you could think about this in climate change, you could think about this, in all types of health disparities. This rings true. So that's really the consequence. Is as extreme as people being excluded to death. I mean, it really does come down to that extreme. Yeah.
So with everything that you're saying, it comes across very clearly that we need to have a concern for how science is communicated and where it's communicated and where it's being made clear. But for those of us who aren't in these typically vulnerable positions, or just anyone from an individual perspective, why should we be incentivized to diversify science news?
Good question. So one of the things that I like to really hone in on when we're thinking about how do we communicate science and make sure it's effective is that being an effective communicator isn't just about what's coming out. And well, let's use me as an example. I'm the communicator right now. You're interviewing me. It's not just about the words that are coming out of my mouth, but it's literally about the way that you're perceiving who I am. So I start with, I went to Cal, I have a degree, I'm a scientist myself. That means it's going to put me in a category where anyone else who's a scientist can then feel as though they connect with me in that way, right? Because their attitude about who I am and perceptions about who I am is going to matter on what they believe. So if you share values, if you share identity, if you trust what I'm saying, then you're more likely to accept my message. So what if you don't know anything about a person, right? If I didn't say that I went to Cal and that I have this background, how do you know if you connect with them? Well, you connect with people who are most like you. So that means you connect with people who are part of your community. And so what you want to do is how we incentivize people diversifying science and one of the incentives is just saying, talk to the people around you. You can talk to the people around you in your community. I can talk to the people in my community. But the other reason why we want to make sure that we have as many different kinds of people communicating as we possibly can is because when I start communicating outside of that kind of identity that I have or those intersectionalities that I have, then I add a level of opportunity for miscommunication. So if I'm communicating with somebody who's a different ethnicity or a different culture or a different language or a different gender or a different age, the list goes on, then that means that I'm introducing error. Essentially, I could be introducing error. It's likely I'm introducing error. So that's another reason we want to incentivize. The other thing is simply that, and I've mentioned this, that we kind of live in the structure that was created, unfortunately, by and for white men. When you have a system that was, well, any system, I don't even want to say that it's built in that way, but if you have any system, you have a hierarchy of credibility, it's called. So who has high power within this hierarchy gets to define how things are. And again, typically race and gender and academic institution all play a role in what are the norms, right? And who gets to maintain power. If you have people who are at the top, they're going to remain at the top. And so another incentive is that if we start including more diverse voices that don't fall within this hierarchy, that fall on, like lower in the hierarchy, and start putting them in places where they're the ones communicating and they're the ones who are in charge, then we try to dismantle that hierarchy a little bit so that more people are able to engage and are able to communicate and are able to participate in STEM.
How can people get involved to rectify all these things that you've outlined that are threatening the image of science, the communication of science, et cetera?
Right. I'm going to point people to a resource because I think it's a really, really, really good place to start. It's called the Inclusive SciComm Starter Kit, and it is published by the University of Rhode Island Metcalf Institute. And this is a science communication toolkit that says, okay, we're going to do science, we're going to teach you, and encourage science communication, but it departs from traditional science communication practices because it prioritizes inclusion, equity, intersectionality, both as parts of the process of science communication and also as the desired outcome. Right? We want the outcome of our science communication to be inclusive, to really be equity focused and to think about all the different parts of who humans are that go into that basically are accounted for when we do science communication, when we do science. And so just from my own kind of bag of tips and tricks on how we can start working in this space, first and foremost is just simply participate. Give a lecture at a bar, or give a lecture at your science conference, right? Your local science conference or your subject specific science conference. Talk to your friends and family about science. The other thing I want to say, which is really important for me to say working at a university, is that if you're not interested in DEI work and you're not interested in education or you're not interested in science communication, I understand. I don't think that forcing things down people's throats is the right way to go. But if you're just kind of an introvert, for example, or you don't feel comfortable giving public talks. The other thing I want to just encourage the whole community to do is to just support and encourage this work. Don't feel like it's work that doesn't belong in science, because it absolutely does belong in science. I hope that I've convinced you that it belongs. This work belongs in science, and it's a part of science. It has to be a part of science. And so if we really embraced how science moves forward, regardless of whether or not if you're actively participating, I think that that's as the best you can do, is just make sure that we all make this a priority, even if you're not engaging.
Awesome. What an inspiring and well-rounded note to end on. So that does it for all of our questions. But thank you. This was a really illuminating conversation. You have a lot of nuance in your ideas and you outline your steps towards what this all leads to very, very well.
Thank you. I hope, again, if people want to contact me or learn more, they're more than welcome to science@cal.berkeley.edu, or even science@cal@berkeley.edu is the email address to reach me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Of course, myself and everyone at the EBI wish you the best of luck on all your future endeavors, and we wish you a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for checking out the EBI seminar series on science communication. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on how science is communicated. Be sure to follow along for future installments or check out our previous series and explore social media, which are all linked in the description below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.